thought it'd be nice to kick off by thinking about the way you centre women in your writing, including, interestingly, through the device of using a male character in Novel About My Wife. So let's start there.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it seemed a natural subject matter for me when I first started out. I was writing my first short stories in my 20s, and I was interested in writing about the kind of life I was leading and the kind of lives that I was seeing around me, but from a particular kind of angle. And I think what I felt, probably not entirely correctly, was that young female voice wasn't very present in New Zealand literature. When I'd studied, been taught New Zealand fiction at school, it tended to be, if it wasn't Catherine Mansfield, it was fiction by older men. Of course, there were lots of women writers, Patricia Grace and Kelly Hume and Janet Frame and brilliant writers like that, who I read and hugely admired, but I didn't feel that there was the sort of work about that kind of contemporary life at the time in the 1990s. So it was sort of writing about a stage of life and writing about a woman's experience of that happened at the same time. It was semi-autobiographical, with a strong emphasis on the semi,
Sure.
And then the rest of my work has followed from that, because I think being a woman in the world, you're always aware that you're not really the default position. And so you're kind of automatically in this position of being aware of your conditioning, being aware of the constructed nature of some of the, the social kind of atmosphere that you exist in, the different sorts of expectations, the different ways that as a woman you progress through different stages in life, and the expectations that often come with that. I mean, clearly this is a massive generalization, and I think it's important to take an intersectional view and not just focus on woman as one kind of mass construct, because that's not the case. But as a position to start from in writing, and as a kind of subjectivity to try and inhabit and to express just the state of womanhood in whatever version of that you want to take, is endlessly fascinating to me. And with the Novel About My Wife, as you point out, I chose to look at it through the character of a man. So I've got a male narrator in that book, and that was really fun to write from his point of view. He's
What was behind that choice?
Well, I wanted to explore, I really did want to explore that kind of masculine perspective. Again, he's a very particular type of man. He's English, he's a screenwriter himself, he's middle class, he's got all of the anxieties and prejudices of his particular milieu. And I liked the idea that he would be ostensibly writing about this mysterious woman he's married to that he can't quite, fathom. But of course he ends up really talking about himself. Yeah. So that was quite fun. And with my new novel, Lioness, which comes out in July this year, it's from a woman's point of view, but it is very much about the experience of being a woman at a certain stage in life again, but I'm no longer in my 20s, so nor are my characters. This woman's in her early 50s, and she's going through all of the different changes that come with that stage of life and thinking about her position in the world. But actually I think I was interested in that book too, exploring the way that women might internalize a male gaze. So again, it's using the idea of the male gaze, but it's through this female narration. She's a woman who's grown up being conventionally attractive, being you know, she's married to an older, very successful man. She's a career woman, but she's also a kind of trophy wife, to use that cliche. And I was, really interested to explore her experience, trying to kind of grapple with and find some sort of agency for herself while she's being subject to her own internal forces of
So without giving anything away,
yes.
What period of time are you going to be covering in her life in this novel?
It's really set in 2018, and it really covers just about a year of her life. With it's sort of, you know, she talks about the past and that sort of thing, but it's mostly the time frame of the action is about.
But you do seem very interested in your other work in thinking across a passage of time. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, well, with The Forrests, which is my book before this latest one, I was interested in looking at a woman's life from her early life to the end of her life. And the structure for that book is more like it looks at these chunks of very intensely felt experience, and then it will have quite big gaps in the narrative and pick her up again at, you know, like 10 years on or 6 years on or 15 years on to tell another kind of moment in her life. And I was interested in constructing it that way, partly to get at that sense of the way we live inside moments and inside not necessarily the big moments of a life like a wedding or having a child or moving or, you know, suffering a catastrophe or grief or anything like that, but the small moments and
moments that affect people's thinking.
Moments that affect people's thinking and affect their, you know, their visceral kind of sensory experience of what it is to be alive. There's a school of thought about, I'll try and get this right. Some people experience their own lives in retrospect as one continuous narrative, and some people experience their own lives in retrospect more as a series of episodes that happen almost to a different version of themselves. And it was that experience I was trying to capture.
Yeah. So in the forest, since we're there now, you know, that kicks off looking at a period that you probably didn't experience firsthand. How did you go about? Because you write. I didn't experience it firsthand either, but you write very convincingly about that period, I think. How did you go about researching that?
Yeah, well, the story of the life that's central in that novel, The Forest, is the life of a woman called Dorothy Forrest, and she is a few years older than me, not that much, but a few years, and enough that she grows up in a kind of commune environment. And I had some experience, I guess on the tail end of that era, not personally, but knowing people who might have lived in those communes. And then also my husband actually had quite close experience of that world. He's a bit older than me, and you know, he was full of stories about what commune life was like, and the commune, the sort of arguments that people would have, and the food they'd eat, and it just always really interested me. And I think because I was writing The Forest when I had, I was writing The Forest when my children, were still probably at primary school. And maybe a little bit primary and intermediate school. One of the things that really interested me about writing about that sort of commune approach to life is that I had, you know, fairly young children at the time I was writing, and there was something about, you know, the nuclear family structure that I cannot really enjoy. There's some alternative to this, you know. And I think that again, takes me to this interest in writing about the experience of being, you know, a woman inside a family, the kinds of expectations and responsibilities, and the different complicated kinds of love that come with that. It's just all really rich material for fiction, I think.
Yeah. No, that's great.
But the other thing, just also to your question about time, is that with the Forrests, it extends into the future ever so slightly, and that was just a sort of fun kind of imaginative experiment to think about the kinds of things that might be around beyond now, but also that the life is continuous, and there's some sort of essential quality to being a human in the world that isn't going to change.
Yeah. Well, do you want to dive in a little bit to your interests in AI and those sort of things? Because that seems pretty germane on that.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote a play called The Maid that was produced last year by Auckland Theatre Company, and that took as its focus a woman who's an AI scientist or developer who's interested in creating robots that can experience emotions. And so obviously it's set in some kind of sideways world to ours, or some sort of future, because as far as AI is advancing and as quickly as it's advancing, I think actual robot emotions are quite some time away, or else would never happen. But I mean, AI is a world that's fraught with ethical problems and considerations, and there's been a lot of, there's a huge amount of misogyny that's kind of, or just, and so I thought that it was, again, I'm not particularly interested in AI and robotics just as the subjects in themselves, but the idea of coming at them through the angle of a woman working in that world, or the kinds of things that a woman working in that world might deem important and might think about, and the kind of frustrations and challenges she might encounter, that's where the drama lies to me, and the comedy.
Yeah. Now, as I mentioned to you the other day when we spoke, back home in Aotearoa, there's a terrific group called the Beths, who've put out this album called Experts in the Dying Field, which is a title that lots of musicians can certainly relate to. You're someone who, both as a writer and a teacher, has taken a great interest in the novel. So I'm interested in, first of all, your view on the state of the novel, and then your view on the broader world of fiction and things that might be replacing it or augmenting it or supplementing it.
Yeah, well, I think the novel, it's definitely not as central to our culture as it has been. Of course, there's like different forms have supplanted it in terms of the centrality of storytelling, but it still does and will always do something that nothing else can do. And there's that extraordinary way when you're reading something, not like when you're viewing something, but when you're reading something, you are, I think, people have written about this, but it's like you are thinking the thoughts of another. That's not my phrasing, but it's very, very powerful experience. And people talk a lot about the importance of fiction in terms of developing empathy, and I think, that's great, that's a function of it, but I don't think that's its purpose. I think its purpose is to enlarge our experience. It doesn't matter about empathy, it's more about, of course empathy matters, but it shouldn't. I think when you focus on fiction being a tool for empathy, it makes fiction sound like, eating granola or something, going for a run, like it has to be done because it's something that's good for you
and healthy.
Yeah, actually, I think it's more subversive than that. It's more fun, it's more playful, it's more wild, it's more free. It should be, if it's good. It should be, it's an art form that has got its own series of rules, but it's also, one of its rules is about breaking those rules consistently. And so I think it's this sort of endlessly exciting play space, and it is, if not about empathy necessarily, it's definitely about connection. So, I think Ian Forster, it's often quoted, only connect or whatever. I think that's from Howard's End, but it's like, yes, I totally agree with that. I think fiction is a great connecting tool, and it's one that can be done, in private. So yeah, for me it's very beautiful, but I also have no illusions about it being less central than it used to be.
What's replacing it apart from video games?
Yeah, streaming, television. I mean, a range of things. It's also that fiction itself is changing, which might be what you're referring to. And I think, there's the rise in what gets called autofiction. It's not necessarily that people weren't writing autofiction 100 years ago or 150 years ago, but there's a name for it now, and it's it's presented in a slightly different way and maybe a little bit more upfront. There's this idea, I think, that readers want to read about actual, lived experience. You get some sort of tang of, I guess, authenticity, perhaps, but for me, fiction doesn't require that. I think it can be like purely imaginative and still just as vital.
Is there anything distinctive about New Zealand fiction?
That it comes from New Zealand. I think that's about it, or Aotearoa New Zealand. I think it's too varied now to say that there's a particularly distinctive element. There's such a range of work being produced now, and different generations are writing in different ways. There's the personal essay form is extremely strong there, so not fiction, but that's very, there's a real movement towards that. There's just such a broad range that I don't think you could say it's any one thing.
So finally, what are you hoping to get out of the Jaipur Festival?
Oh, well, if it's anything like the KLF Festival, which was so wonderful, I think I will, I'll go to see some great events, meet some really interesting writers and thinkers, get to talk to them, get to hear what they've got to say about fiction, get to have a discussion. I'm part of a panel on the feminine gaze in fiction, so we'll be talking about, some of these sorts of things and hearing what other writers have got to say about that too. It's a chance, particularly for a New Zealand writer, to come somewhere which is like a really big international venue, to see what's going on in the rest of the world, to experience it in person, and to see yourself and your country's writing kind of in that wider context. I think it's just a really important experience for New Zealand artists and makers of all art forms to be able to have, because it just gives you a really different perspective, and you can take that back and work with it. And these experiences are always altering and life-changing in ways that you can't predict. So that's something I'm really appreciating about being here, and especially now that we're all able to travel a bit more freely. And
yes.
So
well, perfect note to finish on.
Okay,
So
good.
thanks very much, Emily. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.